hello, and welcome to Anzu Talks. My name is Eric Lau. I'm a VP of Strategic Partnerships at WPP, and I'll be your host today. More importantly, I'm joined by Dylan Collins, co-founder and CEO at SuperAwesome, and of course, Inmar Benedy, co-founder and CEO at Anzu. Welcome.
Hey Eric, hey Dylan.
Hello, hello. So
Hey
today's
guys.
episode of Anzu Talks is how to build a digital world with kids in mind. So we'll be doing an in-depth discussion on what changes need to be made to protect kids while they're online, and how these digital natives are navigating the virtual world in new and innovative ways. We'll also explore how young audiences are beginning to treat platforms as places not only to play, but to hang out, learn, work, consume entertainment, and interact with brands, which is probably quite a bit different than us grown-up gamers remember. We'll touch upon how this behavior will transform the way advertisers interact with consumers, what issues will arise, and how we as an industry can tackle them. And lastly, what kid tech is in place and needs to be built to keep these virtual playgrounds safe and to provide parents with the tools they need to ensure their kids are protected. Before we start, just a quick reminder, make sure to ask questions in the chat box. We will make sure to get to them and answer as many questions as we can towards the end. So please feel free, get involved and ask some questions. So without further ado, let's dive in. So maybe we can start with lifting the curtain on kid tech, so to speak. I think many advertisers, certainly at WPP, we're realizing that kids and their families are who they're talking to with their campaigns, whether they were designed for them or not. I think the pandemic has really established kids as full digital citizens in the home. And there's a stat I've seen that it drives over 61 billion in annual household spending. So how can brands safely connect with them? What role does kid tech play in winning over the digital family unit? What do you think, guys?
Dylan, I mean, you built a successful business from this, right? So you should start.
Thanks, Edmar. Thanks, Eric. Yeah, I think your intro kind of nailed it, right? In a sense that I think the world has woken up over the last 12 to 18 months and understood the power and influence of younger audiences everywhere. And I would say that there was a time when younger audiences just referred to under 13. Today we're probably talking about under 16. And I think that COVID has accelerated the sort of digital leverage that kids and young teens have. It has given them much more responsibility in the home. It has given them much more digital responsibility. I think more and more parents over the last 12 and 18 months have looked to their kids, certainly not as peers, but certainly with, I think, a lot more respect in terms of their general digital knowledge and awareness. And they've become just much more a factor inside the home in terms of purchase decisions for so many different items, from electronics all the way up to auto. And I think brands and agencies have started to realize that they have no choice but to connect with this generation. And I think that the challenge for everyone is figuring out how to do so in a way that's authentic, in a way that's respectful, and in a way that's compliant with all of the very specific digital children's laws that we have around the world, from COPPA in the US to the Children's Code in the UK to GDPRK across Europe. And that requires specialist tools. And I think it's amazing that we are having this conversation, because I think, quite frankly, 3 or 4, even 5 years ago, we wouldn't be having this conversation, because I think young audiences have really sort of been the invisible demographic on the internet. And now as we move into the realm of the metaverse, I think we have this amazing opportunity, from a content perspective, from a brand perspective, from a user perspective, to think about young audiences as a full citizen. So I think it's not just being able to reach them through kid tech, which is very much the case today, but thinking about how should we design for young audiences to make sure we include them. with everything that we're building into over the next 5-10 years. So I think it's, they are, I would sort of summarize by saying that, kids and young teens are no longer an afterthought for anyone within the digital media ecosystem. Itamar, would you broadly agree with that, or do you want to have an argument about some of that?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just maybe add one point. I mean, I think a lot of what's wrong as an industry we're trying to improve in digital advertising is happening significantly better when it comes to advertising for kids. So if I'm speaking about, brand safe environment and transparency and the lack of trust between, publishers and advertisers, I think there's a lot to learn from how it's being structured, both from regulation perspective, as Dylan mentioned, but also from, the duty of advertising companies understanding that, under 13 is these young adults need to be carried with more cautious. So I think there's a lot to learn from kids advertising and applying it in general about advertising, because this is a topic that for many years we're speaking as an industry of how to improve. There's a lot of initiatives that came to try to improve it, and there is just like an area where it's happening significantly better. So just good learnings around that.
I think actually, I mean, I don't want to sort of hijack the whole thing immediately, although I probably will at some point. But sorry, Eric. But I think what we feel is that the future of all advertising and all brand engagement really should be built on the same values that we saw emerge in the kid space. Built around privacy, and I mean real privacy, where there is absolutely no personal data that is being collected or really being harvested. It's built around sort of brand trust and brand safety, and it's built around sort of a real sort of engagement with the user, as opposed to an exploitation of the user, which I think has been all too much the case in certain areas over the last sort of 5 or 10 years.
And it's about alternatives, because advertiser will and should advertise to to kids as to different audiences, and if there's no alternatives that use data in a way that creates a concern, then they will use whatever they can. So I think just because they can around advertising, for like an 18 plus use data in a way that violates privacy, they do it. But as there is no alternative to that, and that's as a standard, there is no personal information being shared, then that's what is going to happen. I mean, I'll put here a bold, idea I have. I mean, I believe it's already happening in smaller stages around Apple, and what they did with the IDA phase. But I believe that this is just stage one for eventually removing, exactly as Dylan said, all of the personal identifiers and all of the unique information, and just creating a situation that you cannot neglect advertising in the Apple ecosystem, if it's iOS or Mac or other environments. And then just the only way to do it is with this strict data use like we see in kids advertising. So as the platforms force it and bring no alternatives, immediately everyone will be aligned. There's not a lot of advertisers who don't advertise for kids because there is no personal information. It's just, this is the standard, and that's why they stick to it, because as Dylan said, and as you said, Eric, it's important audiences that they cannot neglect.
Yeah, and I think it's actually a great concept. The idea that essentially kid tech can become ad tech as we know it today, or like a lot of the same ideas, protections, etc. I think it's a very realistic outcome to all this. So yeah.
And Eric, it's good for Dylan and me, and it's bad for most of the industry, right? So Dylan built his own business around advertising for kids where there is little data, and we build an Anzu, a business around advertising with console and Xbox, where there is by definition very little data. So for us it's good, and we just believe in the cause. So yeah, I believe it will go that way.
Yep. And so, well, I think, thinking about all this, and I guess, some of the protections around, marketing to families and kids. So, what are some good ways I think that you've seen, for both of you, for brands to kind of safely connect with families and kids?
In-game advertising.
Sure. I mean, yeah, specifically in advertising. I mean, I think it's it's interesting if we sort of go through like a very short history of the last 7 or 8 years, let's say in kids and family digital advertising. I think you've seen, let's say from an agency perspective, you might have one media planner that had maybe some expertise, in kids and family, and up to today, you now have sort of entire teams that are consistently working with both kids and sort of general audience brands and are sort of planning and activating engagement, with sort of an entire range from family, to kids and young teens. So there's been like in a very short space of time, even the level of expertise, has shifted enormously. I think if you go back to 2013 and 2014, you were really very, very restricted to sort of limited brand engagement in virtual, web-based virtual worlds, if anyone can remember those. Whereas today you have, kidtech enabled programmatic pipes. You've got kidtech buying options across YouTube and the various, video platforms. You have completely moderated ad formats that are delivered again across sort of kidtech pipes and kidtech plumbing into apps, into websites, obviously into games. The standards are recognized across the industry. And I think, so at a technical level, there are so many more opportunities for an agency or a brand. I think when you look at sort of specific case studies, what you're seeing today, again, is sort of very much omni-platform or sort of multi-platform campaigns that are being executed with creators, with display. They often will have sort of a content aspect and an amplification aspect, to sort of drive that reach. I think they continue to be very, very focused on, direct engagement with younger audiences, because at the end of the day, this is not about sort of the programmatic formula of like chasing people sort of across the internet to try and activate a conversion. What you're really, I think the most successful examples are really trying to build some sort of authentic bond, with the viewer, to actually create a connection, because it's only then, in this particular, or with this particular audience, that those types of campaigns work, because as Itamar pointed out, you don't have that data collection aspect. So, your marketing and your campaigns and your creative, like qualitatively, they've got to be really good. They've got to be interesting. They've got to be exciting. So I think, what we're looking at today is, the agencies that have stopped thinking about kids and young audiences, and even those brands, as sort of second-class citizens, and are putting the same level of effort into those. They are driving huge returns. I mean, you look across sort of many of the toy companies, for example, who have shifted their budgets from, let's say 7 or 8 years ago, they would have had barely any of them were spending 10% on digital. Most of it was all on linear TV. Today those ratios are almost inverted. They're spending 50 to 75% on digital, and they are doing these incredibly imaginative cross-platform campaigns. And just to sort of finish on one point, I suppose, as a bellwether, I suppose, for where we are, I saw the very first industry campaign awards specifically for kids and family digital campaigns, which got launched a few weeks ago. And I mean, there's always loads of awards in agency land, I think, as everyone knows. But this was the very, very first time I'd seen something in the kids and family space, and I thought that really sort of marked kind of a mainstream moment, for how successful and how sort of normal engagement with kids and family are. Itamar, you've probably got like a bunch of like more specific examples from in-game.
Like I mean, when we looked at, the advertising in kids industry, I was quite impressed with some of the standards when it comes to data and privacy and etc. But when it comes to the creative engagement, that's where we saw one of the weakest links. So, and with some research and investigation, something funny, Eric, is that when like a kid sees an ad that is intrusive, what he does, he just closes the app or closes the game, or so they're very not tolerant for intrusive advertising in comparison as for older generations. Maybe they have ad blockers, maybe they navigate around the annoying ads, maybe they move to like a paid version or a subscription model without advertising. And we saw Spotify and Netflix and Wall Street Journals and their verticals, they educated the industry around that. And so the reason why in Anzu we got excited about advertising for kids and saw that in-game advertising should be a good solution is exactly because of that. So there's really good aspects of the value chain, and then the ad is intrusive. So to, on the one side, make the ad that doesn't, that respects the gamer, doesn't, block the gamer from playing the game, but then on the other side, flagging it as an ad, not trying to hide the fact that it's an ad, was a good balance between those transparency and trust and standards versus non-intrusive and playing the game, because those children in many cases don't have the possibility to pay for the game or to remove the ads in one way or the other. Because in general, there's three ways to sponsor a product, right? You can pay for a product, you can steal the product if you use like a pirate version, or you can have ads. So kids are forced in most cases to have ads. So we saw like a way to bring them better experience. And also related to what Dylan said, we saw really strong impact from branding and awareness versus performance in the kids sector versus other sectors, in the sense of how meaningful is the awareness and the consideration for different demographics. So just thought that there's a big opportunity to help the industry, and we jumped into that.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's a great point. I think both of you kind of touched on this like very quickly shifting landscape. It probably makes sense to touch a little bit about just what this digital landscape looks like for kids today. There's stats about kids spending 8 hours per week playing video games. Obviously, brands want to engage with this audience and be there. Obviously, Namar, that's the company that you have. But what does this gaming ecosystem look like for kids? Whereas I'm more likely to be toiling away in Skyrim by myself for hours on end. I think many gamers, younger gamers these days, are playing games that are these multi-purpose worlds, right? You have a lot that are free to play by default. You have content creators and gaming audiences merging, and kids don't even have to be gamers to participate in the gaming ecosystem, which I find super fascinating. So, what do you guys, what are you all both seeing? What does this look like?
Yeah, I mean, I can take this one first. I mean, gaming became their social media platform. I mean, a lot of young adults don't use Facebook, don't use other platforms, and use the gaming platform as the center to their social media interaction. So the chat inside Fortnite is in many cases more popular than WhatsApp or other ways to interact with with their friends. And so I think as they look at the gaming platform as the center of their social interaction, then it gets a whole different perspective versus our generations of we played game, we went out of the game, we did other stuff, right? And this is also connected to this metaverse concept of as people start to spend more time in a virtual world, and as this virtual world takes a center role in their interactions with with other people, then it becomes significantly like appealing for brands, because it's not only the engagement metrics, as you said, of how many people play, how much time they play, how diversified is the audience. It's a matter of like the attention, and it's a matter of like the meaning of that platform for their social experiences and virtual experiences, and then even replacing physical experiences. And like, of course, COVID was an important catalyst of making things happen faster, but I mean, I believe in a lot of other people believe that it's just things that were anyhow supposed to happen. They just came a bit faster. So if now communicating with Gen Z is one of the biggest challenges of marketers, and then on top of that, now gaming becomes a whole bigger thing topic for them, then it's just like a really big opportunity. And it's just like it's just the early days of it. So there's a lot of education of what is the metaverse, like who is the profile of this, Gen Z, and SuperAwesome are doing a lot of education about that. But yeah.
I feel I got to go on a little bit of a rant here, like because I obviously completely agree with Itamar here. I hope, by the way, for anyone watching this, this isn't going to get too boring. At some point, we're going to argue about something. I know it's going to happen, right? There'll be some fireworks here, but I think just to sort of jump on Itamar's points. I mean, look, the gaming is one of those fascinating things which, like, as an entertainment category has been bigger than literally every other form of entertainment for years now, but still that's not sort of a commonly known fact. Gaming is absolutely huge. I think secondly, to again, to Itamar's point, like, gaming is eating social functionality and social time. But the really interesting thing is, like, probably a lot of the people on this call are frequently using the word metaverse to explain this sort of behavior. When you talk to anyone who's a gamer, or certainly anyone under like 16 or probably even under 18, and you say, hey, like, what do you think of the metaverse? They're just going to give you a blank look. Like, the metaverse doesn't mean anything to them. It's like, okay, cool. How many hours are you clocking inside sort of Roblox or Fortnite or even Skyrim? And I think, like, that's kind of interesting, right? Where there's sort of the dissociation between our analysis of what's going on versus how people just see it. And I think that's intriguing, right? And that becomes a really powerful force when, people don't even realize sort of the natural displacement of habit that is happening. And I would suspect that, like, when you look at Mark Zuckerberg's statement of intent around going into the metaverse, of course, they've got specific agendas around VR and AR, but they also see, exactly how that social functionality is starting to sort of bleed across into games and games environments. I think the other point I would say, and it's frankly, it's a challenge for everyone. It's like gaming and advertising have consistently failed to hit it off together for the last 20 years. Right? Like, it is wild that in 2021, we are still having this conversation. When you look at the number of hours spent in the biggest games in the world, like that, that in many cases, that is sort of outweighing platforms like YouTube. It is certainly crushing anything like linear TV. Yet when you look at the amount of dollars that are sitting on those platforms, linear TV still carries tens of billions of dollars every single year. And I think there is an inevitability there, but I also think that, and you would think in 2021, that would be something that had been solved, and yet it hasn't. So I totally agree. I think from, an advertising and brand perspective, there is this huge world that has been there for 20 years, continues to be there, and is absolutely not explored yet. And I think, the decline of linear TV and the increase in social functionality in games means that, I would say the metaverse in general has got to be the #1 priority for every brand and every agency to figure out, a strategy and a policy around over the next 5 years. I just don't think you can afford not to, right?
Dylan, and you know why I'm counting on Eric to solve it? So here's why. I mean, it's about digital natives, right? So as digital natives take the main seats at WPP and the holding groups and the brands, their perspective on gaming versus linear TV will be so different than those more, old-fashioned linear TV buyers who are doing the same stuff for 30 years and just didn't realize that things are changing. So I think that's going to be one of the, important changes in this like shift.
I think that's one of them, right? But I think
one of them,
also, like, at the end of the day, if I'm a media buyer and I want to be able to spend, pick a biggish round number, right? If I want to spend $100 million on advertising, right? there's actually not many platforms that I can put that into, right?
Yeah.
In a sort of, here's 100 million IO, deliver this for me over, pick a campaign length, right? 3 months or 6 months or whatever. There are very few platforms that can actually take that. And I think one of our challenges, right, both from the kids industry perspective and also from the gaming perspective, is we've got to be able to facilitate that level of brand scale, and I think, look, that's where, like, so many of the tools that Anzu is building are so important. But I think until we can satisfactorily answer that to a WPP or to anyone else, I still think it remains a little bit of a theoretical bridge.
Yeah, and also the definition of the gamer, I think it's also, tricky here, and creates confusion at the agency and the client level, because I mean, someone who's playing Candy Crush, or let's take an even more wild example, someone playing chess.com, does he see himself as a gamer? Does the media planner see him as a gamer, right? I think there is like, gaming is such of a broad definition that it just creates confusion about who is even a gamer, what does that even include?
It does, and I would say the other issue is really demonstrating to the brands why in-game and why games matter when platforms like Facebook and Snap and YouTube, for digital, they're working just fine. But that's why I made the point about games eating up social functionality. And I think, like, being able to sort of, to your point, right, be able to really profile, like, and describe and understand who is this audience, what are they doing, what are the hours being spent here, why is this a more relevant platform than YouTube? I think that's one of our challenges.
And let's speak, I mean, you said they're spending time. Let's speak on how they're spending time, right? So, I mean, one of the problems historically, with YouTube and Facebook was user-generated content, right? There was a lot of, like bad examples with pedophilia content and porn content and et cetera, et cetera. With social media, you cannot control it because of user-generated content. Now, a platform like Minecraft or Roblox that has a user-generated content, it's a very different user-generated content, because there's there's restrictions from the platform around what you're allowed and not allowed to do. So on the one side, yes, there is user-generated content. Those creators can be themselves, can do really cool stuff. There's the social element of it, but on the other side, it doesn't come against brand safety in the sense of, what does user-generated content mean? I mean, like, what can happen in the sense of user-generated content in Roblox versus what can happen in TikTok or Snapchat is a whole different discussion. So it like feels like taking the good from both sides of these topics are both really crucial for marketers.
And so first of all, quick reminder to the audience, please ask questions. We're all here. We'll answer them at the very end. So please ask questions in the chat box. But I mean, I think it's a super interesting point. I mean, I think, like, there is a lot here in terms of potential. I feel like, we're beginning to see it, but it's not quite happened yet, right? And so I'm curious, for both of you, really, with, what are the challenges that you've heard from talking to brands, agencies like us, quite frankly, between getting to, like, the vision that I feel like the three of us see, and maybe, like, how does, what you both are building kind of contribute to that? Like, how does that gap get bridged?
I mean, in one word, I think it's misconception. So Dylan mentioned, like, that still some marketers don't understand how big is gaming or what is gaming. And, so that's one topic. And I mean, we spoke about user-generated content. So brands are used, if they hear that there is user-generated content, to flag, oh, it's not brand safe, right? But it's just a different context. So I think these misconceptions around what gaming is and isn't, the rules of the platforms is at least for me the biggest point around it. There's a lot of and progress as an industry around building technology for those environments. Like, for example, Eric, WPP investing in both SuperAwesome and Anzu, I think is an example of how this industry is getting progress in the understanding about this shift. But I think that's the biggest point around this like education topic.
Yeah, I think I think I would agree with that. I mean, I think part of the challenge is also with, a lot of the games platforms or a lot of the metaverse platforms didn't start building, what they have today with the intention of it being an ad funded business. And I think there's a fundamental difference there between, let's say, the metaverse thesis and, let's call it, social, right? So when you look at everything that where most of the digital dollars have gone over the last 5 to 10 years into social, I mean, those were fundamentally designed around an ad-driven business model, or the majority of them were, right? Whereas almost all of the games platforms that are now forming the foundation of the metaverse just categorically were not, right? They are transactional driven environments where users can go and buy things, and that is fundamentally the value transfer mechanism that is in there. So there's no sort of pre-existing ad or brand DNA, and everyone is and we are very much looking at brands and advertisers quite genuinely as sort of co-creators. And and I think that's there's a whole bunch of education to be done here. There's a whole bunch of definition to be done here. But I think that it's important that the entire ad ecosystem understands that, like, with sort of what is being built across all of these various metaverses, everyone is really looking back at the last 10 years of the internet and going, okay, how do we not repeat some of these same mistakes? Particularly around ad engagement and brand engagement, and sort of what does that mean, and what does a respectful user experience look like? And I think it's frankly a little early to say even how that really manifests, but it's like I think you're going to continue to see a little bit of sort of dancing around, I suppose, between people, as the brands and agencies absolutely need to be there for all the demographic reasons we talked about. I think the various metaverse platforms do want them to be there, but there's sort of an interfacing issue, that we are starting to build out. And I think that's why it's really critical that we sort of foster an ecosystem of players who are able to sort of enable all of those pipes, between agencies and brands and into the metaverse. So I mean, this sounds like I'm giving sort of a really easy layup to Itamar here.
The opposite.
I'm saying it because I believe it, but
I'm going to disagree with you now. I mean, we agree to disagree at least one thing, so I'm going to disagree with you. The strength of advertising in the metaverse and in these platforms is the fact that it was not built for advertising. The problem we see now on political campaigns on Facebook, Cambridge Analytica, was the fact that Facebook and those platforms didn't put limits for what is not right and not allowed to use around data. Do you know that Facebook had in the past a pilot around an algorithm to predict if someone is going to be divorced in the next 3 years, and to have a different bid on the price of advertising them? And one of the leading beverages companies was bidding on a higher price because they got a higher return on investment than those. So if someone just got married, Facebook knows he's going to get divorced, and they're putting a bid on him, right? The beauty of those platforms, it's connected, Eric, to what we spoke in the beginning around advertising for kids and what that should lead around advertising in general. The fact that they were built to entertain, to be a social platform, to have strict rules around data, around user-generated content, around brand safety. I think that's going to be the power of why these platforms are going to be such of an important communication channels for marketers in the next 10 years.
I think that's it's an interesting concept. If I can maybe even take that a bit further for you, and see if test this idea. Do you think like a metaverse that is built to be let's say, ad first to some degree, right, from the ground up is bad. I mean, I certainly think if you look at mobile games today, right, a lot of them are built from a user acquisition standpoint first, right? You kind of have that's a first order consideration, and that's it's certainly affected the mobile gaming industry. So do you think it ends up in a worse place if you do that?
Yeah, I mean, first, in hyper casual game, it's not a game, it's an ad, right? Let's call it what it is. It's an ad. Now, I mean, advertising companies trying to be opportunistic took this too far. And now we see bad advertising GDPR regulation came because putting a stop to some of these things. But in those environments where from the get-go there is rules around data and a lot of what Dylan mentioned around his vision for advertising, then if that will be the only option, brands will jump on it. So today marketers are used to do a third-party audit on everything they do. Maybe in some of the metaverse platforms it will not even be allowed to give access to those vendors. So as there is no other alternative, brands will understand that it's or working with the way of how the platform protects their community or not being part of it. And over time, it will everyone will be forced to join to that.
Yeah, I think I broadly agree with that. I mean, I think it's possible that a huge metaverse platform emerges that is brand first, but when you look at the lead that some of the players like Epic and Roblox and a couple of others have, I mean, it's not insurmountable, but it's going to be pretty difficult. But I do, I do think that I'm always wary of talking about sort of revolutions happening because they usually never happen when you expect them. But I do think it is going to force brands to really be much more user-centric and community-centric in their engagement. And I think ultimately, and I would say this absolutely in the kids space as well, it's like you've got to appeal, to whether the person who is engaging fundamentally gives a shit about your brand and about your message and about your story. I think one of the greatest challenges actually on the metaverse or in the metaverse for everybody, it's not going to be advertising, it's not going to be branding, it's not going to be content creation, it's going to be storytelling. How do we tell stories in an always on, much more visually focused environment like this? And I think that's probably the biggest long-term question for everybody in terms of facilitating all these things. I mean, I say that after Ariana Grande in Fortnite, which was absolutely huge success. I don't think we've released numbers on it yet, but it's huge. And I think you can see various people from Epic tweeting about this. Like, everyone believes this is just kind of scratching the surface, right, in terms of storytelling. But I think for brands, it's and their agencies, I really think that is going to be a defining skill set for advertising over the next decade.
Dylan, the intersection of music, gaming, and advertising, I guess that can be a topic by itself for one of the next webinar series, because there's a lot to discuss about that as well.
Well, we should make that a special on rap, because rap pioneered brands and music and gaming as well. So, but anyway, yes.
Well, great. So, I do want to make sure we leave enough time for questions. So again, please continue to ask questions. We'll get to as many as we can here. But I'll kick things off. The first one, I think it's for Dylan, and really, this is probably even related to the point that you're making earlier. But the question is, you said something interesting earlier, to engage with kids more than ever. Privacy, safety, trust, and real user engagement versus exploitation will be critical. Convincing brands is the biggest challenge in gaming. How would you tackle this from your own experience?
I think what we've done over the last few years is invest more and more heavily in research and in insights, and that's probably a slightly predictable answer, but you know, it's still, and I would say this is absolutely true for gaming as well. It is still startling when you walk into an agency or a brand and how little is known about sort of young audiences. And I don't say that as like a criticism of agencies per se, because they are extremely busy and they are running a lot of different accounts, and this is still fundamentally a non-mainstream audience. So we've really focused on trying to produce a lot of first-party research, working with a bunch of other third parties to aggregate that data. And like, I honestly, like, one of the things I've said over the years is that I always wish we had more competition, right? Because there would be more companies that would be investing more in explaining and educating the space. And what we have found is, like, as we show the influence of younger audiences to brands over time, they begin to realize, whether it's from sort of watching their peers take the plunge, or even their own direct experience, right? I mean, nothing changes a brand's view on young audiences like someone in charge having kids themselves and suddenly going, holy shit, like, I'm making decisions at home because my son or my daughter is talking about this particular brand versus that particular brand, or they think this one is better or that one is worse, or they're saying, mommy or daddy, I really don't like that car. I'm going to think less of you if you buy that particular brand of car. So I think all of these things have stacked up over time, and it's really become the cumulative weight of that data. And I think probably, I've said this a few times, and Eric, I'm not saying this just because you're here, but we announced a global partnership with WPP last year, and I think that was the biggest holdco in the world putting their hands up, saying this is an extremely important audience. We're taking it very, very seriously. We're investing into taking it seriously. So I think all of this stuff, really, really stacks up. So there's no silver bullet. But education, company building tends to be education.
Dylan, funny fact. So we had our partnership with WPP. We were supposed to announce it, and then we got from comms a message that there is an announcement that needs to go first, and then we can come after. And then we saw your pretty face on the news. So, FYI.
Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly a very important space. There's no doubt about that. And at WP, we really do believe that, obviously, having support both you guys. But let's see. Okay, so question 2 to keep things moving along. With kids games evolving towards metaverse-based platforms, and in effect, inviting kids to create their own game experiences, what opportunities will this present for brands and marketers to tap into this creativity?
I think let me jump on this, and Idemar might want to follow up. We set up a division about almost a year ago called, somewhat unimaginatively, SuperAwesome Gaming, which is led by the extremely imaginative Nick Walters. And we've been working with a bunch of different brands to help them build games and metaverse strategies for young audiences, starting with Roblox. We've had some fantastic successes with things like Universal Music and MGA and a bunch of others, that haven't been announced yet. And really, it's about sort of understanding, what should the content, or what should the presence be? Do you want to build your own experience, or do you want to partner with a creator? And both are valid, but it really depends on who you are. And then I think secondly, and as importantly, is thinking about, like, how do you amplify that kind of experience. So I think that, like, everything that we're seeing, now and sort of into the future will be some permutation of those things, where it's kind of moving from transient to permanent presence in some of these metaverse worlds.
I think that's one of the reasons for the shift from a gaming platform to a gaming platform who is a social network, so which is a social platform. And exactly as we spoke before, it will bring the like even higher level of engagement. So as you're in the metaverse or you're in the social platform and there is, it's all connected, you can move to different experiences. It's like feels like 1 + 1 = 3 in the sense of bottom line, more time will be spent in the combination of all those experiences together. So that tackles scale, that tackles engagement, that tackles what Dylan mentioned of how many platforms can give you a $100 million, scale of a spend. So that's on the one side, and on the other side, it's about how hard to reach are these audiences, where else can you find them? And then the third point in the triangle, maybe even the most important one, is this avoiding all the problems with social media around brand safety and around on like content you don't want to see like close to your brand. These three things of the scale, the lack of alternative to reach the audiences, and the brand safety and the control over the platform, that will be the sweet spot for brands in this space.
Great. And actually, that's a good segue into Mark, because I think this next one's going to be for you. Speaking about mobile gaming and in-app ads, how will Anzu address the policies around protecting kids from ads which are difficult to recognize from the app content? Is there any case study on in-app native ads being allowed for users under 13?
Of course, and of course, anyone here who wants more information can contact me or someone from our team, and we'll be happy to elaborate. But in general, when you advertise to kids, there is the regulations we all know, and then there is, our judgment into being even more cautious to that. So, for example, when it comes to label the ad, the fact that it's an ad, it's important in every ad for a kid. It's even more important with in-game advertising, because in comparison, when it's a full screen ads, it's easy to understand it's an ad. When there is like an in-game ad inside a billboard in the game, there can be this confusion of, is this an ad? Is this part of the content of the game? So there's even extra cautious and responsibility here in the sense of, this is an ad. We don't want to harm your experience by blocking your screen for 30 seconds with an unskippable video that you will just, not even understand how to cross it, because the X is so small and it's flipping sides, and when you try to close it, it's so small that you will be forced to click it, and you're not in a place to pay for having that game instead of having the ad. So we want to solve that, but we want to be protective for the communities. That's how we balance these two things. There's a lot of other regulations around programmatic, like programmatic versus direct and data, and we can share more of those information. So whoever asked that, that's a great question. I would love to speak more about that.
Great. And next, I think we have a question about the cookieless world and how it applies to kids. So any quick tips on how advertisers can successfully reach kids in a cookieless world, and how will it change the engagement with children online?
Dylan, we had a long conversation about this. Do you remember? Like long time ago.
I do. And I mean, fundamentally, the kids' environment has been cookieless, since it began. That's the whole point around the, privacy laws like COPPA and Children's Code, etc. That they do not allow the collection of any PII, which, fundamentally includes cookies. So, all kid tech, that goes through certification from an FTC safe harbor, is fundamentally reviewed to be COPPA compliant, to make sure that it can engage the user without collecting any personal information on them. So, in fact, one of the sort of the common sort of misperceptions that we run into still actually is that you are not allowed to engage with the under 13 audience. But it's categorically not true. You are absolutely allowed to engage with the under 13 audience. And as Itamar sort of said, brands are a key enabler of content to be accessible by young audiences. What you are not allowed to do, quite rightly, is collect any personal data on them, and that's where kid tech comes in. So I think it's I like questions like that, because it makes us sort of recommit to spending even more on educating the world, you know, about how to do this the right way.
Yeah, and Eric, I'll add two things. So one, what Dylan said about kids environment where there's anyhow no cookies. I can say the same about PC and console environment where by definition there is no and data available. So for us, everything like an IDFA is like a nice to have on top, not mandatory for only for mobile games versus something that we are independent in that we rely on. And I think that's where Dylan and myself are in a great position with where advertising is going from a privacy world perspective versus companies dependent on that. So that's one thing. And second thing, gaming has such of a strong contextual understanding. I mean, you're playing a Barbie games. I have some good, assumptions of who you are. You're playing a racing game. So I think like by the games you're playing, there's a good understanding of who you are. Ads can be more targeted without violating any personal information. And I think that's one of the areas where targeting will go in a privacy world. 10 years later than what it should have happened, but like at least now it's happening. Or maybe Google will postpone it again, right? Who knows?
We'll see.
Sure.
We'll see.
All right, next, so we have a little bit question about some of these in-game concerts. So, Fortnite, Dylan, I think you mentioned Ariana Grande just had an in-game concert. There was also the success of the Travis Scott concert last year. But both of these artists have explicit lyrics within their songs and also cover adult themes. So are there any restrictions around these in-game events if young kids want to take part? And if I may, I'm going to actually make this a little bit harder of a question, which is, how do you think, let's say, metaverses in general should kind of deal with the fact that there's just, user-generated live content, in these experiences, right? I mean, it could be as simple as someone shouting expletives, like, over chat, right? How do you kind of deal with this? It's not just like you're watching a movie that's PG-13 or PG, right? And you kind of just know that that's what it'll be as a parent.
Totally. I mean, I think there's a couple of issues here that, the sort of the broad games and metaverse ecosystem has to deal with, over the next few years. I think one of those is, moderation, and I suppose moderation and safety. And, Apple has, made some not so subtle moves in that area over the last few days. And I'm not going to comment on that other than to say that, like, it is a very, moderation versus privacy is extremely difficult. And I think, you have to accept that it's extremely difficult and that anything is some kind of compromise. But I think when you look at sort of specific areas of moderation, like as we introduce more and more voice, for example, into experiences, like there's a bunch of interesting startups that are bubbling up, looking at solving for real-time voice moderation. And I think, one of the number one, one of the most important metrics, I think, for anyone, thinking about metaverse platforms or operating there is like, what is your level of toxicity and what is your level of counter toxicity investment, that you're making? Because again, sort of one of the themes I have is sort of like, what can we learn from the last 10 years of the internet? What can we learn from social, right? And we know that there's going to be a huge burden of, community, sort of community health, let's call it, right? Sort of non-toxicity, challenges that we're going to have to be investing into. So I think that's a huge challenge, and there's a bunch of interesting companies, as I say, sort of bubbling around. I think the second area that you sort of touched on there is essentially variable content rating systems. And I think part of the challenge here is that, we are, because the metaverse has emerged from fundamentally gaming platforms, which have emerged from, fairly linear content rating paradigms. I think we've got, interesting challenges ahead of us in terms of, how do you rate for, you can call it UGC, I suppose, and that would be accurate, but how do you deal with, like, multi-rated experiences that are housed within a single platform? And I think, again, that's a challenge that everyone needs to be able to have a conversation on, and really think about. And that in turn then ties into, parental controls and permissioning, and how we sort of make it easier for parents to be able to administer and control access to these different experiences over time. And I think, like, there are lots of investments being made in this space. Epic obviously acquired SuperAwesome. Facebook is published very, very interesting blog post about the challenges of user age identification, or age analysis rather, and the other week, which is worth reading. So I think these are all sort of some of the like, they are big, hard to solve perfectly challenges that the entire industry has, and I don't think you can really silver bullet your way into them. But I think I think even though lots of people disagree with lots of things that get said in these three categories, I think the important thing is we're having the conversations now, and we need, and by we I mean sort of the major tech companies, need to continue to have these conversations to make sort of forward progress over the next few years on them.
And Eric, I don't know anything about in-game concerts, so don't ask me about this.
Well, we're close to the end of time, but I do want to try and squeeze in one more question if you could answer quickly, because I think it's actually related, Dylan, to the answer you were giving. Is there a danger that different countries will begin producing different rules to protect kids online? Just like we've seen with GDPR for the EU and CCPA in the US. Do you think there's a way to have one unified set of rules that encompass the safety of all kids, no matter where they're accessing the internet from? Or is it, I guess, just going to be a rat's nest? What do you think?
Yeah, so quick, yeah, please, sorry.
Okay, let me give a very quick response on that. I mean, I think, today you've got a patchwork of different regulations around the world, and they sort of are broadly saying the same thing in terms of preventing any personal information capture on young audiences, but the age definition of a child varies from region to region. Increasingly, you're seeing these laws moving from just digital privacy into user interface, well, UX, frankly, the entire user experience. So right now we have a situation that I would say is absolutely imperfect, and ideally we need to see more collaboration between the regulators on this kind of thing. And I would also say very briefly that it's becoming increasingly complex, because you've got to look at sort of the objective of what the laws are trying to achieve versus like the technical practicality of how you actually do that. And I think there needs to be, sort of increased collaboration between, regulators and the market to try and get this right, because ultimately everyone is trying to make sure that users are protected and that young users are protected. The last thing we want is like unimplementable laws, which frankly don't help anyone.
Yeah. I think it can happen, and I think it depends on the platforms and the rules and regulation they will apply. I mean, from a country perspective, the regulator looks for gaps and tries to solve them for his country, and the regulator always chases tech advancements and new things going on to try to to keep this level of of protection. And I think the good news is that in comparison to social media and advertising in the past, what was the wild west, I think now is privacy taking a more important seat. Platforms like Roblox and Minecraft and Fortnite and even Apple now are significantly putting more emphasis on this. So over time there will be less work for the regulator because things will be in place. GDPR is an example of like those countries got forced to do it because a solution was not being seen, like even looking significantly farther. And as more sagas like Cambridge Analytica and pedophilia content in YouTube, as these things appear more, it becomes more urgent. The combination of the control and the responsibility I see more around platforms today will reduce the need to do this, but still I think it will exist just in a lower scale than what we saw in the last years.
Makes sense. All right, Kasia, we're pretty much at the end of time. So, first of all, thank you, Dylan. Thank you, Itamar, for your time today. Thank you, everyone, for joining here today. And we will be sharing the recording. So, feel free to watch at your leisure tomorrow. Any other questions? Feel free to head to anzu.io. And we'll see you at the next webinars. Thanks so much, everyone. Take care.
Thanks, guys. Bye.
Thank you.